What is up, guys? Greedy Knight here to do a Charge Blades tier list. These are the Charge Blades I would typically suggest to new coming Charge Blade users to build during the course of Monster Hunter. So let's just get started with the video. What I mean by strongest blades is that you need a decent amount of purple sharpness to apply maximum damage for a sustained amount of time. You need non-negative affinity to be used with crit upsets, so you could deal maximum damage, and you need to have at least a baseline of 330 raw attack in order to be considered for this title. When all of those things are considered, you also get a major boost if you have slots on the weapon, so you could gem in artillery or challenger +2, because these skills are pretty good with crit upsets and charge blade in general. First up on the list is the Lagiastorm for the base form, or the Vankram Volt Blade. This is the Lagaigra's charge blade. Looking at the final form of Lagiastorm, we have 340 raw attack, which is above our threshold of 330, and we have 22 thunder damage. So in certain matchups, you're going to be dealing more damage than some other charge blades on this list. And without sharpness +1 or 2, you have just that white sliver of sharpness. But with sharpness +2, you get that massive chunk of purple sharpness. So I highly recommend you pair this with a Josina variant. This is the Gold Edge charge blade, or I'm not going to attempt to name that. This is the Atal Ka weapon, or the final boss of the game. Looking at the final form of the weapon, 330 attack is on the threshold, but this weapon is good for utility with any sharpness +2 set. So you get 60 defense on top of just having this weapon equipped, which is great because a lot of G rank sharpness +2 sets do not have too much defense, so you could run this and make it endgame levels of defense. With sharpness +2, you have that huge chunk of purple. Otherwise I wouldn't bother running this weapon based on how little sharpness it has in general. But that 3 slot is the second reason why you run this charge blade, because it gives you a lot of versatility. If you don't happen to have the best charms, you could make up for it by running this. And finally, for strongest charge blades, we got the Black Strong Arm, or the Fatalis charge blade, which is endgame. Looking at the final form, you have 340 raw attack, matching the Lagiastorm in damage, and in certain matchups you have that 20 damage of dragon to help you boost on top of that. However, without sharpness +2, this weapon isn't much to look at, but with sharpness +2, you get that chunk of white and purple just stacked on there, so you could actually outperform other weapons when you can maintain that sharpness. I would recommend running this with the Josina set as well, because it has razor sharp and you have absolute readiness to maintain it, and with the 3 slots given by this weapon, you could actually reach about 70 affinity. Independent charge blades are weapons you could tack on to any set and it'll work just fine. Typically they would have slots, good affinity, or just natural purple. So yeah, not much else to say about these. My personal favorite is the Seditious Blade, or the Sedition Severer. I use this for my entire run of Monster Hunter Generations and well into G rank for Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. It has a lot of good qualities that I will be diving into. Looking at its final form, it's not too impressive. 290 base attack, which is lower than the 330 threshold, but has 20 affinity, which makes it easier to achieve 100% crit with specific sets. And it has that natural purple and that long white to compensate for having less damage overall. And then you have the 2 slots for customizability with sets, which is always a plus. But one thing with sedition weapons in general is that it has a built-in blade scale ability where every 5 dodges you resharpen your weapon by 5 units. So you can maintain white for longer and not worry about it. Paired with absolute readiness, you could always be fighting in white, and if you're dodging a lot, you could be fighting in purple. Next up is the Tigrex Divide, or the Tigrex weapon. One thing to note is that you have to fight the 20,000 HP Tigrex to fully max out this weapon. Looking at the final form, you have a matching 340 raw attack to Black Strong Arm and Lagia Storm, but you have that minus 15 affinity, which is what docked this weapon down in terms of strength, but it has that natural purple and a chunk of white, so with absolute readiness and razor sharp, you could potentially maintain white throughout the hunt. With that 1 slot, it does kind of help, but it's not too many slots to be considered super good. All in all, you would only build this if you don't have access to other weapons, but overall, it's a solid pick regardless. This is the best deviant weapon line in the game, and the best charge blade in the game. I would be lying to say that this weapon is easy, but once you get it, the world of charge blade opens up to you. Prepare to hunt a bunch of rust razors for this. Looking at its final form as usual, you have 330 raw attack, which is on baseline with other charge blades. You have 5 affinity, and you have that massive chunk of white sharpness. On paper, this doesn't look like much, but in practice, it means you don't need sharpness plus 2, you don't need razor sharp, you don't need much of anything in terms of maintaining your sharpness. Your damage will never drop off in most hunts, which is ridiculously good for this weapon. And on top of that, it's being a deviant weapon means that it charges your hunter arts faster, so instead of absolute readiness, you could actually run the chainsaw charge blade art, which is pretty good for maintaining and dealing a lot of damage in general. But the reason why I speak so highly of this weapon is because you could pair this with a specific set to get 100% critical affinity and challenger in the same set. The difference between purple and white sharpness is 7%, so you don't need to really invest in handicraft points, which allows you to run points for challenger. And having a 20 raw attack boost to your weapon, and then you multiply that by both critical up, which is 1.4, and your white sharpness, which is 1.3, you are matching the damage of Lagia Storm and Black Strong Arm, which is why this weapon is so good. On top of being so versatile, this weapon is just the best charge blade in my opinion. And that's enough on that. Honorable mentions are weapons that don't do the most damage, but they have a specific niche that allows them to be what I consider good enough. More generally, these are support weapons or weapons that work really well with a specific set. So let's just get started. This is the Horror Zafar or the Malfestio charge blade. You could finish upgrading this by G2, I believe. Looking at the final form, we have 310 raw attack, which is under baseline, but you have 22 sleep, which the reason why this charge blade is good at all in my opinion is because you put monsters asleep and then ultra their face, which does double the damage of your ultra. So you could KO monsters and then open up more chances to attack, which is pretty good in favor of this weapon. With sharpness +2, you reach that purple, but you could kind of run this without sharpness +2. But yeah, it has one slot, which helps with customizability, but for the most part, this is a solid weapon to pick up in general. Next up is the Hero Strong Arm. This is a charge blade you unlock after pulling the sword out of Kokoto Village. Looking at the final form as usual, we got 290 attack, which is pretty low, but it has a massive 50 affinity, which you could pretty much guarantee a crit if you're hitting weak spots with Tenderizer, or what I like to do is pair it with Critical Eye and Chain Crit so that you could guarantee a crit or get close to guaranteeing a crit wherever you're hitting the monster. So that's one thing to keep in mind. This weapon isn't worth using unless you have sharpness +2 and you have the one slot to help with customization, but overall it's pretty niche for some crit strats, but it's pretty fun to use. I wouldn't recommend it as a go-to weapon, but if you want to build it, go for it. Next up is the Diablo Strong Arm. It's the king of raw attack, and you have to hunt a G rank hyper Diablos just to get it, but it's well worth it if you want to do some raw attack strats. Looking at its final form, you have 370 attack, minus 20 affinity to balance that out, and without any modifiers you have a sliver of white sharpness, but with sharpness +2 you get a good chunk of purple and white. To top it all off, you have one slot for customization. Overall, this charge blade is pretty solid to build if you aren't particularly worried about doing the most damage, but doing a good amount of it. Because this weapon pairs well with any artillery up set, because impact valves scale with raw attack, so if you use this, you should be aiming for the head pretty much, because you'll get KOs a lot easier than, say, the Rest Razor Charge Blade. Last up is the Ruiner Reaver Charge Blade. Pretty much you'll be running this during endgame, but for the most part it's a fun blast weapon. Looking at its final form, you have a measly 270 attack. The lowest attack of all the charge blades on this list, but you do have the 50 blast damage, which somewhat compensates for it in that it triggers explosions on the monster, and those typically do like 100 raw damage ignoring armor or whatever. Also, you have 30 affinity, which helps with crit upsets, and based on its sharpness you want to pair it with Josina. Basically, because it also has 3 slots like the Fatalis Charger, you could pair it with Josina and then get 100% affinity as opposed to 70. Guaranteeing crits and occasionally causing explosions is pretty good, which is why this charge blade makes the list. That's it for the video. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more content. Greedy Knight signing out. Bye.